Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for being with us. As the saying goes, two things are certain in this life: death and taxes, and both of them will cost you. From 1986 to 2025, funeral costs increased by 304% in the U.S., meaning something that cost $1 40 years ago now costs about $4 today. Inflation, changing customer preferences, and rising labor and material costs have all contributed to the price hike. Today, cremation is the most common end-of-life choice in the United States, with more than 60% of Americans choosing it in recent years. While cremation is often less expensive than a traditional burial, accompanying funeral arrangements can still carry a significant cost. As a result, some are turning to alternatives like green burials, human composting, and body donation programs. While some are going these routes to reduce costs, for others, these choices are about aligning final arrangements with personal values, environmental concerns, or a desire to contribute to medical research. Today, we'll explore these alternatives and whether they leave surviving loved ones with a meaningful way to remember the dead after they are gone. Joining me for this conversation today, we have Chad McGreevy, funeral director at McGreevy Funeral Homes. Hi, Chad.
Hello there.
Also with us, we have Tom Harries, CEO and co-founder of Earth Funeral. Thanks for being with us, Tom.
Good morning.
Also with us, Danielle Davis, director of Anatomical Services at Ohio State University's Body Donation Program. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you.
And with us as well, we have Jeffrey Gompf, president-elect of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association. Hello, Jeffrey.
Morning.
We would love to hear from you. Maybe you've thought about your end-of-life plans, and maybe you haven't. Maybe you have questions or comments or a story you'd like to share about something you experienced with end-of-life plans for a loved one. To join our conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org, or you can message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. We're going to start with an email that we received from Pat in Concord. Pat says, please ask your guests what churches charge for funeral these days, in addition to what funeral directors charge for their various services. So that brings us to our first question for Jeffrey. Jeffrey, what is the average cost looking like for a traditional burial today?
Traditional cost for burial kind of varies on region. Obviously, funeral home providing the services. Every funeral home has different price structure. I would say a good range for families. When you're talking traditional burial, you're probably anywhere from the $6,000 to $9,000 range. Would be a good number to keep in mind. And like I said, once again, kind of varies on region. Merchandise selected by the family, services selected by the family, cemetery fees. A lot of different working parts kind of go into those costs.
How does that differ for cremation then?
Cremation, services with cremation, the general consumer sometimes thinks that cremation is just cremation, no service. But when you talk cremation, there's a wide range of things that can still take place. We could still have viewing and service for loved ones prior to the cremation taking place. But when you talk cremation versus burial, typically kind of the driving force and cost difference is not as much merchandise. So like the casket and the vault and those sorts of things, those are not necessitated in cremation services. So cost comes down when you don't have those factors in there.
Okay. Can you give us a ballpark of how much? I know you said for a traditional burial, we're looking at here in Ohio, maybe $6,000 to $9,000. Any idea of what that ballpark would be for cremation here in Ohio?
So with cremation, the number varies more vastly just because you can have cremation, no services, all the way up to, like I said, a full service cremation with rental casket, embalming, those sorts of things. So, you could look anywhere from $1,800, $1,700 for a simple cremation, no services at some firms, and then depending on where on the spectrum the family lands with services and kind of everything else entailed to it, you could
Mm.
be $4,000 or $5,000.
Okay. So that is something that's interesting, I think, to point out here, just to stay with you for a minute, Jeffrey. If someone does choose cremation for their end of life final arrangements, there still could be a traditional calling hours, maybe, with the body there visible for people to visit. Is that something that you see happen often?
Yeah, families, every single family handles the grieving process differently. Some families, that simple cremation, hey, have the cremation take place, return mom to us. We're going to go scatter her, at Lake Erie or her favorite spot on the property, all the way up to, hey, we still need that closure aspect of having mom present and having that funeral service and having mom's minister and friends come in. So, it cremation's kind of predicated on what the family feels that they need for their grieving process.
Okay, thank you for that. Tom of Earth Funeral, can you tell us what is natural organic reduction, also known as human composting, and how does that work?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Human composting is the colloquial name for a process that is officially called natural organic production. And what this process does is provide an environmentally friendly alternative to burial and cremation. I think the closest parallel is probably cremation. So instead of cremating a body and turning it into ash using fire, we are using microbes to gently transform a body into nutrient-rich soil. The process takes about 30 days. At the end of the process, you're left with life-giving soil, and the family chooses how much soil they would like returned. So they might choose to keep it, they might choose to scatter it, they might choose to plant it. And any soil they don't wish to keep is donated to conservation projects. So think reforestation, think ecosystem restoration. And the beauty of the process is it's a gentle, natural process, it's better for the environment, and it offers a return to nature.
Can you tell us anything about where those conservation projects exist? Are those happening here in the United States? Is this soil being shipped internationally? Where is it ending up if it's not requested back by the family?
Yeah, so my accent is a little deceptive, but this is 100% taking place in the United States. We currently support as Earth conservation projects on the West Coast. I think a good example was our first project in the Pacific Northwest. Like a lot of land in the Pacific Northwest, we're working with a project or a piece of land that was historically logged. And we are using the nutrient-rich soil to plant native trees to restore this land to its former glory and protect it for future generations.
Okay. Danielle, I'd like to ask you now, what happens to a person's body after it's donated to medical science and who ultimately uses it?
Certainly. Pardon me. So, our donors typically take part in educational programs. So, that can be anywhere from our undergraduate anatomy students learning the different aspects of the human body, all the way up through our dental students, our medical students, who then ultimately go on to study many different things, take part in research, as well as patient care. And our donors are typically in the program for up to 2 years. And at the conclusion of their time in the program, then we do provide the cremation, and families have the option to have the cremated remains returned to them. Or we also do have a mausoleum space, and there is no expense to the family for any of that.
Okay. Can you tell us, Danielle, some medical research advancements that we've gained from people donating their body to science?
Yeah, certainly. So, given that we're primarily focused on the education, it's tough to necessarily make those one-to-one ties. But we do know that, a lot of our medical students go into cancer research, or we also look a lot into Alzheimer's, dementia, ALS, all of those terrible, terrible diseases that afflict individuals. And we're really providing that groundwork for these medical students, particularly even pathology, of really trying to understand from a kind of a stasis standpoint, obviously, these are the first teachers for these individuals following their passing, of course, and allowing them then to see, how a quote unquote normal individual looks versus maybe an individual who has some sort of abnormality, and being able to decipher and distinguish the differences between those.
And going back to what you said in the response to the first question there about what happens with the body. So once the body has been used scientifically and there are some remains left, those remains are then cremated. Is there ever a situation where there are no remains left to cremate, or is that something that is promised when someone donates their body to science?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Everything stays with the individual. So the individual is cremated whole, so to speak, at the time of the conclusion of the program. So we are returning the whole individual to the families.
Okay, so different than maybe an organ donation situation, for example.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that, Danielle. Chad, can you explain to us what makes something a green burial and how that's different from a traditional burial?
So a green burial is a natural return to the earth there. We don't use any embalming. We often use a woven shroud made of cotton. We will often meet at the cemetery within a day or two of the passing. The family will help with the burial there. We'll lower them into the ground, usually around 4 to 5 feet. And then the family is welcome to participate in actually placing the soil back on top of the person if they want. They don't have to, but often folks find that to be a closure aspect there. And then the soil is mounded on top there, and the person is set for a natural decomposition.
Okay, thank you for explaining that for us, which leads us into a question that we have from an audience member. We are talking about traditional burial alternatives and end-of-life options here on The Sound of Ideas today. If you're just joining us, the number to call in is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. We have Katie from Akron calling in. Katie, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Please go ahead, Katie, if we have you. We'll make sure that we can get Katie connected, and we will bring Katie in here in just a moment. I think we're working on that connection now to bring in Katie from Akron, who I understand is a fourth-generation funeral director and has a comment on how she'd like to pursue her end-of-life options. We'll see if we've got Katie now. Hi, Katie. I think we're working on getting Katie connected, so we'll make sure we have her, and then we'll return to that in just a moment. And while we get Katie connected, Tom, I'd like to ask you about the legal status of human composting right now. Can families here in Ohio choose this option? Is it available? I know you mentioned you have a partnership in the Pacific Northwest for a conservation project.
Yeah, great question. Natural organic reduction first became legal in the United States in 2019. That was in Washington State. Fast forward 6, 7 years now, and it's legal in 14 states. Ohio is not presently one of them, but all this means is that the process cannot take place in Ohio. So as Earth, we work with families both at time of need, so a loved one has passed and you require our services, or planning and prepaying for the future. We're a licensed funeral establishment in Ohio, so we work with those families already. The big difference is the process takes place out of state, which allows people to choose this option, but is not really what they're after. So Senate Bill 323 this year, sponsored by Senator Blessing, would allow for the process to take place in Ohio. So this ultimately ensures families don't have to incur the cost and complexity of transporting their loved one to another state. So not legal just yet, but hopefully soon.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Tom. We appreciate it. And I believe we do have Katie in Akron connected now. Hi, Katie. Welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Please go ahead. Hi, Katie. Are you there?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I
Welcome
am.
to The Sound of Ideas. Please share your thoughts with us.
Sure. So I have been a funeral director for about 12 years, and I have decided that for myself, I would like a green burial because I'm just seeing, how the sausage is made. But I really want to give my nutrients back to the earth and become part of the mycelium. So, and I love educating people about this stuff. So thank you for this discussion today.
Thank you for that. Katie, if you don't mind, if I can ask you a follow-up question, then with the green burial, is that something that your family and loved ones have weighed in on in terms of, as we think about what happens to the people who are left behind when someone has passed?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand what you're asking.
Okay.
My family?
Yes.
Or,
yes, your family
yeah.
specifically, if
My
there have been
family,
conversations.
Honestly, we probably don't talk about death as much as we should. Me and my immediate family, because it's just our everyday, it's our life. So my husband does want to bury me on our property. That's his thought. But beyond that, we haven't discussed it much. It's not really much more affordable than a standard burial, though, if you have to go to a green cemetery and things.
Sure.
So that's, one thought.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that with us, Katie. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Todd, speaking of cemeteries, Chad, speaking of cemeteries, are there specific legal requirements or cemetery regulations that families need to follow to have a natural green burial? I know that our caller just mentioned specific green burial cemeteries.
Yes, there are a couple of specific green burial cemeteries in Ohio that offer natural return to the earth. There's also some hybrid cemeteries that offer both traditional burial and they have a natural burial section there. In Ohio, there's no certain law saying one way or the other whether you can have a hybrid cemetery or a natural cemetery, but most cemeteries have their own regulations. They'll often require that you use a vault there, because when we started doing burials, years and years ago, it was hand dug by, 4 or 5 cemetery sextons. Now they often have backhoes coming over to do the digging, and that can actually crush the caskets that are buried underneath there. That's why most cemeteries will require a vault. However, since it's a natural cemetery or a conservation cemetery, they're often hand dug there, and there's no need for any backhoes there for it, so that you can have someone buried without a vault.
Can you explain to me what you mean by a vault, Chad, in terms of a green burial?
Yeah, so a vault is a typical concrete or metal structure that the casket is placed in. When we arrive at the cemetery, the vault is often below ground to start, and then the casket is placed in there, and then the lid is lowered on top there.
Okay, and excuse me if I'm misunderstanding this, but wouldn't incorporating a vault do away with part of the purpose for a green burial? Would that prevent the remains from returning to the earth?
Yes, so we often do not use a vault for a green burial. That's mostly for a traditional burial.
I see.
That a vault is used. In a green burial, we'll often use a shroud. On occasion, we'll use a woven bamboo casket. It's a hand-woven casket. It looks more like a basket there. Most green cemeteries will not allow a vault there. There are some hybrid cemeteries where they still want to allow for a form of green burial, where they'll have a bottomless vault, where it will still protect the cemetery land above, but will still allow for a natural return to the earth.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was unclear about what we were talking about. So you're saying a vault would be required in a traditional burial situation, not in a green burial situation?
Not in a green burial situation. That is correct.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got an email now in from Jen. This is related to the cost of some of the more conventional ways to handle end-of-life arrangements. Jen wrote in, "My brother died in 2020. Cremation, short family calling hours, a little vault for his ashes, and internment cost over $20,000. We went as simply as possible." Jeffrey, this brings me to you. As funeral costs keep climbing, what is driving these price increases, and how can families avoid getting hit with unexpected expenses?
Obviously, you touched on it kind of earlier. inflation, tariffs, cost of materials, cost of labor have all gone up, especially exponentially in the last several years. One things families can do when looking at end of life options. Number one, not always the case, but if you can speak to funeral directors, funeral homes, Ohio State for anatomical donation or any of the different options prior to the need of funeral services, you can get a lot of questions answered as to what cost of goods are, and kind of work through that process beforehand. And I know sometimes, passings occur unexpectedly, and families are rushed into the process, thrown into the process. But once again, sometimes families call a certain funeral home, and that's where they want to be, and that's all well and good. The family has been served by that funeral home for a number of years, but this day and age, call around, ask some questions to different places potentially. When you're going through the process, make sure you're asking a lot of questions of the funeral director and funeral home that is providing the services to you all, just to kind of make sure that everybody has a good scope of everything that's going on.
And in terms of management of this, is calling the funeral director, a good place to start? Or do you really have to manage things between having an arrangement with a cemetery, having an arrangement with a funeral director, maybe having an arrangement with a church if you want some sort of religious aspect to an end-of-life arrangement?
So what I would say is your funeral director, your local funeral director, your local funeral home is always a great resource. They have those connections to the cemeteries. They have those connections to the local clergy. So that funeral director can help facilitate those conversations with all those. They might already have, pricing information for that cemetery. Most funeral homes try to keep local cemetery pricing at the ready, so that they can answer questions for families. But most of your basically all of your funeral homes and funeral directors are good asset for families when they have questions pertaining to funeral goods and services that they provide, as well as different options, alternative options, green burial, human composting, anatomical donation, as well as good information for local clergy, as well as those cemeteries.
Okay. We have a question in now from IdeaStream Public Media's Amy Eddings, and I'll direct this to Tom of Earth Funeral Services. And the question is, who is opposed to alternative burials? Might funeral directors be opposed to this, for example? I know, Tom, you had mentioned that there's some legislation working its way through that will make human composting available in Ohio in a way that it hasn't been before. But have you come up against any opposition to these alternative options?
Yeah, great question. I think the consistent opposition we see is from the Catholic Church as an institution. And I say institution because we find individual Catholics actually resonate with what we do and choose it for themselves and their loved ones. What we say to this is we understand as well as anyone that end-of-life choices and funeral options are a deeply personal choice. And we also realize that the Catholic Church was pretty slow to accept cremation too. So the fact that they are slow to accept what we're doing is not wholly surprising. But our main take on this is consumer choice. We are not mandating that anyone choose it, whether it's composting or whether it's natural burial. If you don't believe in something, you simply don't choose it. And that's not a great reason to prevent others from choosing it. If you still want to be buried, you can be buried. If you still want to be cremated, you can be cremated. But we think educating people to their options and making available alternatives that are perhaps better for the environment or lower cost, etc., is really important.
Thank you for that. If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about end-of-life options, Particularly, we're talking about alternatives to traditional burial or cremation services. If you have a question or a comment, the number to call is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. We have a note now in from Frank Tascone, who is the executive secretary of the Cleveland Memorial Society. We don't necessarily usually share first and last names for our audience comments that we receive, but it's particularly relevant here because this person is involved with an organization that he wants you to know about. So Frank writes in and says, I wanted to mention that for a one-time $25 application fee, the Cleveland Memorial Society provides access to reduced fee funeral services, direct cremation for $1,200 and direct burial for $1,400. The motto for the Cleveland Memorial Society is simple: dignified, inexpensive. Also points out this service can be used for green burials. So thank you for that, Frank. Again, that's the Cleveland Memorial Society sharing that resource for people who are interested. A $25 application fee for reduced fee funeral services, which include the option for green burials. Thank you very much for that. Again, if you want to call in with a comment or a question, the number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Danielle, we have been talking about this as potentially, at least partially, a cost-saving measure, these alternatives. And as you mentioned before, there's no cost to the family if someone does choose to donate their body to anatomical medical research. Does it mean, though, Danielle, if you do that, does that mean the family has to skip having a traditional funeral or memorial service before then the body comes your way?
Yeah, certainly. So, as a funeral director and embalmer myself, I certainly recognize the importance of having that family time, that togetherness, of being able to pay your respects and get a little bit of closure. Unfortunately, given the preparations that we need to do for our donors, we're not able to have traditional showing with the traditional embalming, calling hours, and the like. We do certainly encourage families, if the funeral home is willing, to have a small private gathering with immediate family, just because we never want to prevent an opportunity for families to have those final few moments. But once they are into our care, like I said, we do those preparations. We do, though, also encourage folks to have memorial services that can be with image of the individual present, or any memorabilia or things that they enjoyed in life, just to have, again, that opportunity to come together. And then, of course, we do also offer once a year a memorial service honoring all of the donors that have passed in the previous year. And that's a fantastic opportunity for families to come together, not only with their own immediate families, but to share in that unique experience with other families who know exactly kind of what they've been going through. You know, we certainly recognize that 2 years is a long time from the time of passing to the time of the return of the cremated remains. And we recognize that that's kind of opening a wound when they do receive those remains back. So we certainly are sensitive to that and want to make sure, like I said, in the service of the memorial service and having everyone come together, that they can kind of have that shared experience, and kind of just have an opportunity to speak with others who know what they're going through.
And is that a typical timeline, 2 years, Danielle, from the time of donation to the time of receiving the remains?
2 years is the maximum amount of time. Sometimes it will be a shorter period of time, could be a year, depending on what educational program our donor takes part in. But we really make an effort to make sure that families understand, like I said, that it can be up to that 2 year time period, but also then communicate, once everything has been completed, so they're aware that they can then receive the cremated remains at our office. We can also send them through the U.S. Postal Service. Actually, that's the only way we're allowed to do that. And then, or again, like I said, we have the mausoleum space.
Okay. We got a call in from Mark in Strongsville. Mark couldn't stay on the line, but I'll direct this question to Jeffrey. Mark wants to ask about aquamation. Jeffrey, can you tell us anything about aquamation?
So aquamation is a term used for alkaline hydrolysis, much like human composting, not legal in the state of Ohio yet. Um, there are some alternatives for families to choose that, and then the funeral home, much like with Earth Funerals, kind of have their loved one taken to a state where that is available. So aquamation is an alternative to a cremation service, so very similar um, process there, just as opposed to flame and fire cremation, it is an aqua form of disposition.
Okay. Another caller, Ann, couldn't stay on the line, but wanted to note for the audience she prepaid for her cremation and it was cheaper, she said. She said she wanted to help her children avoid the cost and is emphasizing that investing in your future and family's future is important. And thank you for that. Some of the things we've been talking about here have been some of the things that aren't necessarily easy in Ohio. You know, Danielle just mentioned the only way that to return the remains after the anatomical donation is through the United States Postal Service. Tom, for something that can't happen, body composting, human composting here in Ohio, what does the transportation process look like for those bodies, for people who choose that process? Are there challenges that come along with that?
Yep, absolutely. And actually, just to riff off Anne's comment as well, we highly recommend pre-planning. We think it's one of the greatest gifts you can give to your family and children. You're doing two things. You're easing the burden on your family and friends because you've planned and prepaid everything so they don't have to. They can focus on grieving. And then you're also, as Anne says, locking in today's price for services in the future. So you're sort of inflation protecting yourself, if you will. So pre-planning is a highly recommended part of general end-of-life planning, and we recommend it too. In terms of transportation, as a company, we've got used to it. Ohio is not the only state, of course, which has not yet legalized the process. So for a fixed cost, we charge one price. We charge one price only. That price includes everything that the family is going to need, including transportation to an out-of-state facility. So no hidden fees or surprise costs at any stage of the process. And we handle all of that. So it adds additional complexity to the process, but we handle that on behalf of the family. So from their perspective, it is straightforward.
And what happens with the soil? I know we mentioned conservancy projects with the soil that comes from human composting, but are things being grown in this? Plants, fruits, vegetables? Do we know?
Yeah, so let me address the fruits and vegetables first. This soil cannot be used for food production. It cannot be commercially sold. So there are some really nice safeguards to keep everything safe for everyone.
I was very curious about that, so thank you for clarifying
Yeah,
that. Very
yeah.
interesting.
So let's clarify that first. But some of the most rewarding stories we hear are how families use the soil. So we've had great examples of families recreating road trips that they did with their loved one, and they're scattering a little bit of soil at each stop that they stopped off at. Or we've had families plant small potted plants, perhaps a bonsai tree. We've had families plant memorial gardens. We've had families plant larger trees. And actually, I think one of the things that families really like is the ability to become a tree, or at least as directly as you can, given existing end-of-life options, become a tree. So yeah, people love planting, people love scattering. Soil is, in our opinion, a much more accessible output of an end-of-life process than something like cremated remains, perhaps.
Okay, thank you for that. Chad, can you tell us about the difference in what a green cemetery might look like without headstones, for example, or other markers that you might find in a traditional cemetery?
Yeah, so a green cemetery looks essentially like a prairie most of the time, occasionally a forest. You would not know you were in a cemetery unless you had been instructed you were in a cemetery. You look out and it's just a meadow oftentimes, and then a few trees here, some high grasses there. It's a beautiful setting there. It looks almost like a nature preserve.
Okay, thank you for that. I do have a question here in from an audience member asking about reports of mismanagement of bodies. You know, of course, we hope that doesn't happen, but it is something that people are having questions about. So, Jeffrey, can you speak to that?
Mismanagement of bodies pertaining to what?
You know, that was as specific as the email got, was hearing reports of mismanagement of the body. For example, I can imagine a situation where it may have happened before, that maybe someone was cremated when they weren't supposed to be cremated, that kind of thing. Can you just speak to whether that's rare, how often that might come up?
It is a rarity. That is one of those things that no one ever would want to have happen. Obviously, the family wouldn't want mismanagement of their loved one, nor is a funeral home intentionally ever having mismanagement happen. A lot of funeral homes have very strict process, chain of command, processes in place that would, you know, help prevent those type of mismanagements. But no matter what processes are in place, the human error sometimes does come into play, and very minuscule opportunity to have that happen. But like I said, human error. It does happen from time to time. It doesn't happen at all that often, but you do hear those cases from time to time.
Danielle, do you ever have instances of that have been reported, maybe not necessarily in your program, but mismanagement of the body in this case of scientific donation?
Gosh, yeah, unfortunately, you do hear things in the news, and it's incredibly disheartening, especially not only for the incredible gift that people have given us through donation, but just the family impact and the thoughts and ideas that can run wild as a result. We really, like he was saying, have the processes in place to really ensure that the chain of custody, that we know exactly where every donor is. We have extremely stringent rules for any of the students working with the individuals, really trying to emphasize that this was someone's loved one. This is, yes, we have to kind of think of it again as the first patient, but have that kind of distance. But that person still had memories and loved ones that cared about them. So really trying to hit all of those home, and really just making sure that we're emphasizing through our informed consent process that we have these safeguards in place, that we can, again, human error is human error, and certainly not an explanation or an excuse. But like I said, we really try and be as forthright and as transparent as we possibly can to try and allay those fears. And we always are happy to answer questions from our families that call in. And, again, just the idea of education, of making sure that people understand what we do and what we don't do.
Sure. One final question as we wrap things up here. This is to Chad. We got an email in from Susan in Willowick, and her great-great-grandmother is buried in a grave with a traditional burial. She's wondering if she can have her cremated ashes placed in the same grave. Is that possible, Chad?
So that's a question for the exact cemetery she's buried at, but often most cemeteries will allow for traditional burial there, and then a set of cremated remains to be placed on top. I would encourage her to call that cemetery directly and find out, but I would think that it would be a strong possibility that would be the case.
Okay. Well, this has certainly been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank our panel for being here with us for it. Chad McGreevy, Funeral Director at McGreevy Funeral Homes. Tom Harries, CEO and founder at Earth Funeral, Danielle Davies, Director of Anatomical Services at Ohio State University's Body Donation Program, and Jeffrey Gompf, President-elect of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association. We appreciate all of your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.